Thank you, Orlando. Thank you also for inviting me here. I must say that I decided very quickly to accept the invitation for three reasons. First, it's always very difficult to say no to Alberto. Second, it gave me a new possibility to visit this wonderful city. And third, I was not told until afterwards, after accepting that I should also write a paper. I would have. That was a quite wise way of doing it. I must say that I started with a task that was quite difficult because I have myself not done any research on inequality in higher education since many years ago. So I could not base myself on and I normally also am an empiricist doing empirical research. So it was a bit difficult. So I decided to make some kind of literature review of some both old and recent research. And to paint a picture of this topic. Well, the main question is actually that once you know the characteristics of the Nordic countries, one might raise the question whether enrollment in higher education is less unequal than in other countries. That is my main question, which I can say already now, I cannot really give a very clear answer to that, but let's come back to that. I went through quite a pile of books and articles written during the last 50 years, most of them during the last 25 years from different parts of the world, and tried to review this in a way, because I found that normally I will have presented a lot of tables or figures for you, but this is not easy when you deal with the comparative research, because the figures differ, the methodology differ. Some of the research is extremely advanced statistically, which is both difficult to understand and even more difficult to pass on. So I have not done that. But I went through quite a lot of research, both comparative projects and also some data or results from single countries. And not only the Nordic countries, to understand this question, you have also paint a picture of what's going on in several other countries. I will mainly focus on social class differences. I say a few words about gender, and I have nothing in my presentation about enrollment by minorities. As I said, I have not gone into the problems of different enrollment by ethnic group or minority. There are many reasons for that, but this could be done in a further elaboration of the paper. Let me just say a few words about that, because some recent research from Norway showed that, as expected, minority groups, children have problems in school, both in compulsory school and upper secondary school. They have high dropout rate in upper secondary school, but at the other hand, they are overrepresented in higher education. And especially in prestigious fields like medicine, there are a very high proportion of immigrant, especially immigrant girls. So this is shows that there's a very complex pattern of both falling behind, but also being in the front in the choice of education. Not all about that. I have not only been focusing on the situation and access and in higher education, because, as I will come back to, the differences, the social inequalities, they have their origin during the whole educational career, from compulsory schooling, well, already what students do in compulsory schooling, and all the way through upper secondary into the entering higher education. Show a little picture. I don't know how much people know about the Nordic countries. This map shows these 4 countries, actually 5 countries. It is not actually correct, because Iceland is much further away from Norway than it's written on there. We are talking about 4, 5 relatively small countries, with 3 countries with a population about 5.5 million people. Sweden is about the double, about 10 million, while Iceland has a population of only 350,000. I will not say very much about Iceland, not because they are small, but because it's difficult to find relevant research, and even more because Iceland, since it's so small, they have not enough capacity for their own students within Iceland, so almost half of all Icelandic students study abroad. That would give a very, so let's forget about Iceland, but it's a very nice country to visit. A few words about the Nordic countries in brief. They are, with some exception of Iceland, geographically quite close. 4 of the countries very close. Also close culturally and to some degree historically. But there are, even between these countries, there are large differences in nature and natural conditions, which is also important for type of industry and economy. Denmark is a small, tiny country, almost flat, ideal for agriculture, so they have one of the world's most advanced agriculture systems. Finland is mainly forest. Most of Finland is forest, so they have a traditional forest industry, but also over the last decades some high-tech, which is also the case for all the other countries. In Norway, has a long coastline, where the codfish come from, and a lot of mountains, a little forest, very little agriculture, but fishery and oil and mining. And we have become embarrassingly rich over the last 50 years because of from the income from the oil industry. Sweden, as was traditionally the most developed industrial country, much forest and mining iron, so they have very early developed industry, and Sweden was almost always be the big brother, not only in population but also in economic wealth, but not anymore. And Iceland is long coastline, volcanic, and people can only live around the coastline, not in the interior. It's possible, not possible. We are industrialized still, but the profiles are different between the countries. Furthermore, Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, we can easily communicate. We have almost identical languages. Iceland stopped develop their language back in year 1000, so they still speak the same language as we did in the Viking Age, but not impossible to understand. And Finland have a completely different language, with the share only with Estonia, I think. Nobody can understand Finnish, perhaps the Finnish themselves. And but there is also a small Swedish minority. Actually, not say small, but it's a Swedish-speaking minority. Historically, there have been quite a lot of similarities, and we have been connected together. which I should not go into. In the paper I will write a little about the historical thing. And all 5 countries have very high living standard. We are about the most high living standards in the world. And we also score very high on all kind of happiness and living condition indexes. And there are, which is very important for this topic, relatively small income differences. The concept of equity or equality, I don't think I will go very much into it. I don't have to talk to English-speaking people to really understand the difference, whether some political reason, because traditionally, when we did research on this field, we were talking about equality and education, not equity, which has been popped up rather lately. But it's more about fairness, inclusion, inequity. I will use the term equality, but it wouldn't have different if I used the word equity. What is the problem? Why should we study this field? Is it important? What are the arguments for equalization? First, as Alberto also pointed out, education is an extremely important source for income, from wealth, from future, for working life, and etc. And also not only income and work, but for health and everything. So cultural participation, political participation, level of education is a very, very important indicator for what will happen to you in the rest of your life. And also, educational inequality can be argued to be problematic since lack of social effectiveness. If you can't utilize all the talent in the population, but important groups of people fall behind because they come from the wrong social class, etc., or wrong gender for that reason. We cannot. It's set the country back in economic development if we cannot use all talent, especially in small countries, is important. And fairness, it is not fair. It's not fair if people with the same level of talent don't have the same chances for getting education. Also, social discord, it can make unrest and problems in a society. And also can be used as an argument of representativeness, a bit like what you talk about gender differences, that if both men and women are represented to the same degree in the same kind of positions, it can be problematic. So there are many reasons for doing this. A bit on political background. I based myself on a book written by a Danish researcher, Espen Andersen, which is quite important. He made a distinction with 3 different types of welfare state models. What he called the liberal model, characterized in USA, Canada, Australia. He didn't put Great Britain into that, but I probably would do that. Where the social system is characterized by targeted contribution to the weakest. There is a small welfare state, much private actors. That there is not state activity in welfare. It doesn't mean that it does not exist, but it's mainly given by support given by private actors. Then you have what's called a conservative model, which is Austria, France, typically continental Europe. Less emphasis than in a liberal system of market mechanism. It's marginal distribution mechanism in the system, and very much is based on family, support the family and family system. And then you have the system that we have in the Nordic countries, what's called the social democratic model, which is typically by a policy for redistribution of both in taxation system and etc. And what is interesting, also universalistic, not targeted support. This model we could easily, and I will say a few words about it later, which is very important to understand difference in the student support system and funding system for higher education. Let me say a few words about educational policies in the Nordic countries. There's much more to be said than I have written here. That first and foremost, all the Nordic countries developed already more than 150 years ago a kind of comprehensive school system. They didn't do it immediately, but over that period from around 1850 until 1950, they developed what is called a comprehensive school system, a school for all, not by different classes. After World War II, the higher education policy was, or the educational policy in general, related to the development of the welfare state, as I just said. That means that almost all education is public in the Nordic countries. They don't pay fees, neither in compulsory, in upper secondary, or in higher education. It's a tuition-free higher education system. Mainly, there are some private actors, especially in Norway and Denmark. And also, we have a very generous student support system. Mainly, there are a big differences. Denmark is regarded as the most generous, since they have mainly grants, while Sweden, Norway, and Finland have a loan-based system, where loan is not related to family income. They all get the same amount of money. This is also typical then that, as Claire said about British students now moving back to the parent home, most students in the Nordic countries live away from home. And the typical in our system is that a student is regarded as an adult individual and not dependent on his or her family. So that means that's very little family support to the students in Nordic countries. They relate themselves with the money they get from the state loan system and grants, and working themselves. Then I go into some of the trends and differences in what research on equality in higher education. I start with a very much cited book, which was almost a reference book for many, many years, by Jussi Schaavit and Hans Petter Blossevelt in 1993, covering 13 countries. And they pointed at, of course, this marked educational expansion which hadn't taken place. They found that in Sweden and the Netherlands, there had been a decline in inequality between social groups, while in all other countries, the inequality were more or less persistent. So that means that, well, in most comparative research, only Sweden has been elaborated taken into the project, but not Norway and Finland. I don't know why. Well, I know why. But so Sweden is, so to say, both here and very often used as a kind of a proxy of the Nordic countries. So their conclusion of Schaavit and Blossevelt very much was that social inequality in access to higher education had been stable, no development towards more equality, in spite of the strong expansion. They found also that the most of the social differences had their origin in the transition from compulsory to upper secondary schooling in the early school career. And they had remarked that there had been a marked reduction in gender differences. And they also found that education reforms seemed to play a very low impact of educational reform. So this conclusion for many years was taken as granted. That was how it is. But later, research has opposed this to some degree. And a new book also with Joseph Shavit, Arem and Gamoran from 2007 had a slightly different conclusions. They found declined inequality in most countries, with some, and especially that they did not see an effect by binary unitary systems. So whether this is due to newer data or newer research methods is difficult to say. But they found that actually was visible signs of equalization. This was also supported by a later, almost another research by Breen et al. And they found also that reduced the transition from primary to secondary education, the effect on social background had declined. So to say that selection moved upward in the system. Let's go to some data from Nordic countries. It is to say that we have a very favorable situation for doing such kind of research in the Nordic countries because we have national register statistics. It is a problematic with today's regulations about this, but we can follow age groups, whole age groups in the whole population over years. And old research from Eriksson and Jonsson found that equality in Sweden decreased until 1970, but then was stable. And another study by Eriksson and Jonsson found little support that expansion itself had any effect on equalization. In Finland, quite recent research by Osmo Kivin and some others, they found that higher education is affected by social class and parents' different education, quite strong, but the differences between academic and non-academic families have been reduced with the odds ratio, which I will not go into explaining what is, that which is illustrated the probability of children going to higher education has increased from 19, the ratio between the highest and the lowest group is reduced from 19 to 8, which is quite considerable sign of equalization. I found the same in a study I participated in together with another Norwegian, Knut Knudsen, and the late Åge Bødker Sørensen from Denmark, that it had actually been a decreased inequality in Norway from 1980 to 1990. This was later confirmed by Marianne Nordli Hansen, professor in sociology. And this figure is quite illustrative. It's data from the Statistics Norway. The blue line, upper line, is the age, the group of 19 to 24 years attending higher education with parents with higher education, more than 4 years. And the lowest one is for people with parents with only compulsory education. And we can see that while actually the two upper curves for people with higher education is more or less stable in the period from 1982 to 2018, while especially the group with only compulsory education had increased quite considerably. At the same time, had to be said that this group has diminished from being the biggest one to be actually quite small one, while the group of the parents with higher education have increased strongly. So this has to be taken into consideration, that the groups themselves, whether a social class or family background, educational background, is not stable. It has, as a part of the educational expansion, of course, it has, so between this has changed very much. This was also more or less stated by Jens Peter Thomsen in a recent research from Denmark, that the ratio between academic and non-academic families had been reduced from 4.1 to 3 to 1. But in the selective university programs, the ratio was about 8 to 1. And this is a quite important finding, which also relates to what Alberto talked about, this maximally maintained inequality, or especially effectively maintained inequality, that while enrollment in higher education in total has been more equal, the upper classes keep their favorable position in their enrollment to the most prestigious programs, to the university versus university colleges, or in prestigious study programs like medicine and law. A very interesting research contribution came only a couple of years ago, which is written by a group of Thomsen from Denmark, Norwegian, and some Finnish guys, Swedish guys. They put together a completely comparable statistical database for all the four countries, so they could really do exact comparisons about the development in these 4 countries. And they found that almost all fields of higher education had been equalized from 1985 to 2010, but not in the most prestigious programs, which support the theory that just cited. But also they find very interesting that, contrary to the belief that the development in Nordic countries is more or less the same, it is very different. They found that Finland and Norway enrollment had been quite clearly equalized. In Denmark, there had been very modest development toward equalization, but the pattern was more or less stable in Sweden, probably, or at least partly, because Sweden had been equalized earlier than the other countries, and then stabilized. So this is more or less the pattern shown. I'll say just a few words about the general pattern. That is, in spite of massification, higher education is still strongly unequal in access, whether you use parents' education or social class. So, but the difference is that the trends in different countries have been quite different. And this, again, that the non-university institutions have contributed to more equality. We call it non-university or university college, etc. This is also true for the Nordic countries. They are slightly more, definitely slightly more equal in enrollment than the other countries. And perhaps also the trends are stronger in the Nordic countries than in the rest. But still, inequality is very strong also in the Nordic countries. So I would say that the pattern of inequality is more visible than the trends toward equalization. And also that family economy seems to be not very important in the Nordic countries, much less important than parents' education, which we can discuss how to do, what can be, what conclusion can be drawn after that. So many signs whether this is related to educational policy or general policy in the countries, whether it has to do with welfare state models or class structure, it can be discussed. It should be said that the outcome of higher education is lower in the Nordic countries and many other countries, which has also always been used as an argument against introduction of student fees. That the premium of getting a higher education is much lower. It's narrow than in most undergraduate. A few words about gender. That the gender differences have disappeared and even been turned upside down during the last decade. As late as in 1970, I think less than 10% of the students in medicine were female. Today they are in clear majority. The same in law. So the women have taken over more or less all kind of higher education, also in the most prestigious program. But still we find strong gender diversity by field of study. Technology is still male dominated, but the women have the same dominance in nursing, teaching, for example, that it had many decades. They have not let the boys come in there. So this is quite an interesting question. Why, when we can say that we to some degree have succeeded and not only equalizing the pattern between males and females, we have not succeeded in the same development by social class. To some degree, we would say that it's quite obvious, but still it's interesting. I don't have too much time again, so I had to drop a bit of these last figures, even if I love them, because why do we find these social differences in enrollment in higher education? I've been a bit hesitant whether I could go into it, because it would actually started writing a new paper. But so I just say a few things. First of all, this figure is more or less a copy by Raymond Boudon's famous book from 1974. That at each level where there is students, the youth have to make a choice. The choices are made different by people from different social classes. So for each transition point, the group become more and more socially selective. And Boudon also used a very important concept, that this is due to primary effects and secondary effects. Primary effects are those differences that between social classes in school achievement, that students from higher classes, upper classes, do better in school than those from lower classes, whether this is due to genetic or social cultural factors. Sociologists we skip out the genetic part of it, because that we cannot do very much about. And secondary effect is that youth with the same school level make different choices. That is, I could have illustrated this very elegantly by that in a project by Marianne Nordli Hansen, as I just mentioned, that among those students have the best grades from compulsory schooling. Almost all classes go further into academic tracks, while among those who have the lowest grades, almost none from the lower classes, but about 40% of those from highest classes, poor them, go further to academic tracks. And with about middle grades, the difference is quite large. This illustrates this choice effect or secondary effect. There have been a lot of, I'm aiming at that. Several theories have been raised about why educational inequality rises. The oldest theory was something called the value theory, that it was due to class-specific values about education. That simply people from the labor class, they didn't value education so much. This is not very popular theory anymore. And then we had the cultural theory, was especially popular for a long time due to Pierre Bourdieu from France, which has a lot of followers, but nobody really understands what this is about. I don't understand really what habitus is, the way Bourdieu presented, but that culture and language mean something is obvious. While the theory developed by Raymond Baudot, he called himself the social position theory, that the choices you make are dependent on what level you are. And this was developed further into a very clear rational choice theory by especially Breen and Goldthorpe, that everything is about gains and losses of what your choice are. And also they raised the theory of risk aversion, that is, the fear of downward mobility is much stronger than the wish to upward mobility. So I think my own favorite is clearly the last one, which it explains, because since the choices are so important. Let me turn to summing up this. No, I was too quick here. The Swedish sociologists Robert Eriksson and Jan O. Jonsson, two good friends of mine, have actually, I believe, leaned quite a lot on them. They have raised that their summary of the reasons for the social inequality, which I think it's quite valid. That the first, academic performance is better among children from higher classes. This is absolutely the most important factor. And this actual educational costs are higher for lower classes, primarily affecting transfers, especially to higher education, because it costs money, and you have the most important cost in higher education, that you are not working and earning money. That is the most costly to take higher education. And that the third one, actual probability of success, is higher if parents have higher education, help support during school, and that perceived benefits of higher education are higher for children of higher classes. That was, I said, this risk aversion theory. And the last one, the perceived probability of success are higher from lower classes, especially on these earliest educational choices. This was a far too quick discussion of a very important topic which should be elaborated, but I think we have developed quite a lot of good explanations of why this is happening, and based on that, there have raised quite a lot of proposal of what kind of policy, what kind of educational policy should we elaborate to diminish the differences, as also Alberto pointed out. I picked up a few points both from the OECD paper and from Eriksson and Jonsson. First, that is to prioritize early childhood education. That it's access to higher education, excuse me, clear student support system doesn't play such a big role, that really the differences that origin in early childhood, clearly. And also you should limit early tracking and postpone selection. In systems where you select children different tracks very early, inequalities are greater than if you keep them together. You should avoid socially segregated schools. Either by some schools are more costly than others, and therefore better quality, or whether all schools recruit students from their neighborhood, because neighborhoods are socially differentiated. Also, entry regulations should be based as far as possible by objective criteria, that is grading. That is probably controversial in many places where they prefer all kind of interviews with the incoming students, etc. But the more objective, the better. And access to all higher education should be possible for all who have formal qualification. That is, a system as open as possible, and a generous student support system. Say nothing about what is best, loans, grants, or whatever, but the system should be generous. I think that was all.
Okay, thank you.